A lot happening from Ecuador to Argentina in South America, and you may not be surprised to know we've brought in the expert, Zoe Alexandra, journalist and editor of People's Dispatch, to help us cover them all. Zoe, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, great to have you. I'll start with Ecuador, which recently just had a presidential election, which I guess has had the outcome is not clear. I mean, we know one person is the victor in a technical sense, like he has assumed power, but perhaps not in a real sense of the actual ballots. So, I mean, maybe just give us a sense of what took place this past Sunday in the runoff presidential election there in Ecuador.
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly the correct way to characterize it. It's sort of a inconclusive electoral result. So incumbent President Daniel Noboa, who, just to remind your viewers and listeners, he is the son of the richest man in Ecuador, part of the kind of banana fortune. He is also one of the youngest presidents in Ecuador. He was elected president in this kind of crazy moment in Ecuadorian politics when Guillermo Lasso had activated the cross-death mechanism amid a massive corruption scandal. So he's only been in office for just over a year, during which there's been essentially state of emergency declared the whole time. But that aside, Ecuador went to the polls back in February. This was the first round of the elections to elect again the parliament and new president. And in these elections, there was a result that was quite different than other first rounds presidential elections had had. And this was the fact that Daniel Noboa, incumbent president, and Luisa González of the Citizens Revolution were essentially neck and neck. They were essentially tied. In previous electoral processes in the first round, the first place person you would usually take around 30%. There's many candidates in the first round of the electoral process. You know, the other candidates would take maybe 20%, then 10%. It was much more of a possibility of representing different political currents that then in the second round would of course come down between two candidates. But in the first round of these elections, it was, there was a difference of percentage points between Daniel Noboa, who's on screen right now, and Luisa González, who's from the progressive movement of the Citizens Revolution Party, which comes out of course, Rafael Correa, former president. And so heading into the second round, it was very clear that the race on April 13th was going to be very close. And it was going to be a dispute and a race for every single vote. And what happened this Sunday is that, leading up to it, again, all of the opinion polls showing Luisa and Daniel neck and neck. She won considerable endorsements from major sections of Ecuadorian society, namely from the Pachakutik Party, which is the electoral arm of CONAIE, which is the largest indigenous confederation in Ecuador. And for those of you who are familiar with the mass mobilizations that Ecuador has seen in the past decade, oftentimes led by CONAIE, made up again of these different indigenous peoples and their organizations across the country. Luisa González received support from CONAIE. She received support also from centrist groups and sectors. So it seemed like a lot was going in her favor. And the opinion polls leading up to the elections were showing that. And we're not just saying that these opinion polls said this and then the election results didn't happen, but there was legitimate sectors of society that said we're going to vote for this candidate. And Sunday comes around and the results start to come out, and it's showing that Daniel Noboa is ahead by a significant amount, an amount that was not shown neither in the opinion polls ahead of the race or in the exit polls. And he eventually, the National Electoral Council of Ecuador declared that he had won the polls with about 56%, and Luisa González, of course, trailing behind him. Again, several percentage points behind. And immediately, and even when the first results started to come out, there was kind of this sense of uneasiness amongst the progressive camp. And leading up to these elections, it's important to point out that even before any instance of electoral fraud may or may not have taken place on April 13th, Daniel Noboa had already violated many different electoral laws. for example, he, again, as I mentioned, had been president for the last year and a half. And under electoral law in Ecuador, when you're running for a position and you are an elected official, you have to resign for the campaign period because otherwise you're essentially you would be using state resources for your campaign. Daniel Noboa not only did not do that, but he used state resources to, for example, award different bonuses and checks to underprivileged and underserved communities in an effort, of course, one can only assume to increase his likelihood of winning the second round. And so a lot of irregularities have been pointed out. On Sunday, after the results came in, Luisa González, in a mass rally, announced to the media and announced to the Ecuadorian people that in her opinion, in the opinion of the Citizens Revolution, a grotesque fraud had taken place, one of the worst ones, she said, in Ecuador's recent history, in the history of it being a republic, and that they were not going to recognize the results. And since then, of course, Daniel Noboa has said, I recognize the results. There is no fraud that took place. But we've seen that the international reaction has been divided. For example, Claudia Sheinbaum, the president of Mexico, has said that she does not think that these results are valid. Mexico, of course, has suspended relationships with Ecuador since Daniel Noboa himself ordered a Ecuadorian police to invade the Mexican embassy in Quito in order to arrest Jorge Glass, who had been granted political asylum. So Claudia Sheinbaum, a major player in Latin American politics, has said she would not recognize it. Gustavo Petro, Colombian president, has said that he also thinks that what happened on Sunday does point to electoral fraud and offered political asylum to people from the Citizen Revolution who are now being persecuted. So at the moment, Daniel Noboa has still claimed that this was valid, that the National Electoral Council results are correct. But there is still some ambiguity, there's some division, and the Citizen Revolution movement has said that they will continue to demand that there be a recount and that these results be kind of made invalid.
The international division is quite important to point out, Zoe. I also wanted to ask, the election was conducted under the state of emergency in several provinces, with the military playing a pretty significant role in overseeing the process. And of course, critics have argued that this may have compromised the fairness of the election. So I'm curious, what are your insights into how that state of emergency and that military involvement may have influenced voter turnout and the overall integrity of the electoral process?
Yeah, this is another key reason why many people have questioned the outcome of the election. And it's important to point out that since January 2024, basically all of Ecuador has been in a constant state of emergency, with Noboa having declared a civil war in the country and a war against criminal groups. And this has meant that for the past year and a half, almost year and 4 months, Ecuador has been in a state of essentially constant and intensified militarization of the territory. And so not only is there an increase in number of, police officers you may see on the street, but also now there's actual military deployed across Ecuadorian territory. And this has had horrible consequences. Like we know, in December, there were 4 young Afro-Ecuadorian boys who were kidnapped by the military, disappeared, and found incinerated days later. And so this military presence in the country has had real impacts on people's lives, has already caused fatal victims, and of course has a chilling effect on people's participation in a democratic process. Having a state of emergency and an internal conflict for over a year and 4 months means that, there isn't, life as usual is not as it is. People are not living in sort of a free country. They're not living under normal circumstances. And this, of course, impacts how they interact with, electoral process, democratic process. And of course, there's doubts, there's, considerations to be raised about the fact that the military were overseeing the polls, that they were overseeing, many different aspects of the electoral process. That is, of course, an irregularity in how the elections should be run in the country.
No, I think it's an important issue, and yeah, there's so much to be said about all of this in Ecuador, which we'll have to keep talking about and coming back to. But I also want to touch on Argentina because something pretty significant happened, I think kind of flew under the radar. The foreign exchange restrictions were lifted at the same time a $20 billion IMF loan was given out, which is amazing because Milei said the IMF was like a Soviet-inspired institution when he was running for office. Just like he also said he hated China, but it seems like when people start handing out free money, he starts to change his position. But that being said, I mean, talk about the significance of this for the living standards. I mean, you all recently had a video on People's Dispatch of some extreme police brutality against senior citizens, primarily protesting against the deep decline of the living standards. So how does this maybe positively or negatively affect what seems to be a pretty tough economic situation for Argentines?
Well, Milei ran on a platform saying that he was going to combat the political caste, that he was going to stop inflation, that he was going to dissolve the central bank, that he was going to dollarize the economy, and essentially, pull everyone out of economic misery. And he came into office in December. It's been, a year and 5 months now. Of course, none of that has happened because he's, unwilling to take the measures that are necessary to actually alleviate the structural issues in the Argentinian economy. For example, he has, of course, had another negotiation with the IMF. And as a result, has taken out this $12 billion loan once again. And, the Argentinian economy is one that is really dominated by the dollar. And if you look at its history over the past, several decades, this has been a determining factor in people's living standards. In other countries in the global south, monitoring the exchange rate with the dollar might not be kind of like the main determinant of people's economic well-being, but in Argentina it really has been. And one of the key indicators of the economic health of the country is whether or not they're able to kind of sustain a low devaluation rate. And for the first year, it seemed that Milei was trying his hardest to maintain this low rate, not letting the dollar kind of gain too much strength. And that of course needs more dollars to be in Argentina. And essentially what happened on Friday, there was a televised announcement by Milei on national TV saying we're going to lift this restriction on how many dollars people can buy, and lift this kind of exchange rate cap. And essentially, this can send the dollar into free fall. Many more people can buy dollars, and it does have an impact on people's livelihoods. This increases the prices. And in the past several days, I was just looking at some numbers before getting on here. There has been, not only has the peso went from 1,000 pesos to the dollar to 1,200 pesos to the dollar in just the span of a couple of days. And this is a serious devaluation. It just sounds like numbers, but this means that one day you have, a certain amount of money, the next day that money is worth a significant amount less. But again, this then is reflected in the prices of things because people say, okay, it seems like the economy is going off the rails. I think I need to raise prices because I'm not going to be able to make as much as I was making before. And so this is added to a situation where many different sectors are being impacted by Milei's cuts for example, in the different departments, people losing their jobs, the mass layoffs that have been happening. All of these measures, which he said were going to alleviate economic stress in the economy, have not done so. And so now he's going back to the IMF, taking out more debt, $12 billion of debt, and essentially pleading to kind of these big capitalists like, okay, I've gotten more dollars in the country. I'm eliminating this kind of cap on the exchange rate. Hopefully things will go well. But again, this is a really short-term solution because once those $12 billion, that's the first disbursement, the $12 billion, runs out, they're going to face another issue of not having enough dollars in the country, not being able to sustain the exchange rate with the peso. And once again, Argentina is going to be further indebted. Milei is unwilling to take other measures to really kind of make people's lives better in the country. Don't even talk about nationalizing any of the industries, which Alberto Fernandez was also unable to do to really challenge big capital in the country. But again, the solutions that he has come up with, which is austerity policies, which is cutting education, which is cutting pensions, which is cutting people's jobs, still not working. This IMF loan is not going to solve any of these long-term problems, and people are just going to be further indebted. Again, foreign debt is one of the biggest issues facing economies of the global south. It's always the people who have to pay these. And so he may be given this short-term solution right now, but it is not going to help the Argentinian people in the long term. And Milei is not going to be able to run away from this economic crisis.
Yeah, no, I think that's the case. Let me just ask you this quickly before we let you go here. Related but sort of separate issue. I mean, the issue also of currency valuations in Latin America is a tricky issue. I mean, there's, this website Dollar Blue that's, quotes the exchange rate between the peso in Argentina and the dollar, also Venezuela. You were telling me there's actually more of these websites out here, but it's relevant because no one really knows like who these people are, what they're doing. I personally, and I'll say it, just me, tinfoil hat, that I thought Dollar Blue was the CIA because then, they're often quoted then by the Federal Reserve of the United States. So that means the whole world is adopting these kind of made up valuations that have a huge impact on how policies play and can be used to really undermine governments, as they have been in Argentina a number of times.
Yeah, I mean, we are living in an age where the economies of the global south are dominated by the dollar. And I think it's really hard for people in the United States to actually understand what that means because we live with the security of the dollar. Our wages are not impacted by whether or not our currency kind of falls with regards to the dollar. But the fact that, the Dollar Blue is kind of an insane construction, and what has been happening for the past couple of months in Argentina is that you see the Argentina central bank has set a certain exchange rate. The Dollar Blue continues to grow, and so at a certain point you have to say, okay, this is fictitious, this is what people are buying the dollar at, and these governments in the end are forced to kind of make peace with what the informal market is saying about how much their currency is worth. And I think it really underscores the fact that when we live in an international financial system that's dominated by the dollar, where countries, even if they have their own sovereign currency, have to tender in the dollar. They have to have a certain reserve of dollars in order for them to do international trade, in order to pay their international debt. This means that everything depends on their ability to get dollars. And this means that certain players in the economy are going to have more power. For example, in Argentina, it's the soy exporters, which are able to, get the biggest amount of dollars because they're, the biggest exporter. This means that they have kind of an outsized role in what happens in Argentina's economy. This means that, whether or not they export and get dollars impacts then, if people's salaries are going to change. And I think what's interesting is that last week at the Dilemmas of Humanity conference in Sao Paulo, these discussions, not just about this kind of hot topic concept of de-dollarization, but what does it actually mean to make economies that are sovereign and independent from the power of the dollar? Because it's impossible for the global south to actually have its own independent financial and political path and ability to, advance their economies, to make, material conditions better for their people if they're constantly dealing with a currency that is not their own and that they don't actually have any power over. The US can print as many dollars as it wants and shore up its own economy. The countries of the global south do not have that same luxury, yet their economy depends on it.
Absolutely. Well, the good news is you can follow all of this at peoplesdispatch.com.
Yes,
.com.
please follow us at People's Dispatch on all social media platforms and our website, peoplesdispatch.org.
Okay, I got scared it was a .com and I messed it up. You had a great
No,
video,
no.
by the way, about the Dilemmas of Humanities conference. Great wrap up of that multi-day event that I hope people check out in addition to Argentina, Sri Lanka, and every other country on earth. Zoe, you are the editor of People Dispatch. Thank you so much for joining us here on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.